Good day to all of you. I'm Jay Pearlman, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to a very, very full plenary. This is the end of an interesting week. It's been our first direct experience of organizing a virtual workshop, and I wanted to acknowledge Ben Roberts and Nanad for the contributions they've made and the lessons they've taught us. Many times you think you know what you're doing and then suddenly things happen. And in part, you need a lot of flexibility, and so you'll see that there are some changes in the schedule. As we went through the week, we realized that adapting and shaping the plenary based on the working group discussions and outputs was really important. But there was another factor that we talked about. If we were just going to have 4 hours of lectures now, we probably could have pre-recorded and everybody could have slept when they should be sleeping. So we recognized that this really needed to be an interactive meeting. And as a result, we've changed the schedule to reflect opportunities to get together and talk, including a breakout discussion among participants, which you will find very, very interesting. The idea of sharing priorities, and that's through a tool which I hadn't seen before today called Codigital. You find it very easy to use and a lot of fun. And with the whole process of the value of this meeting and the ability to do the breakouts and others, we wanted to make you aware, as we've said earlier in the kickoff plenary, that the real goal of the workshop is to guide the Ocean Best Practices System and its steering group for the next 3 to 5 years, basically a strategic plan. We've taken the view of the community very, very seriously, as those of you who've watched us, and this is a major opportunity to think through the next generation of what you need. So from that perspective, the OBPS is a service to the community, to your community. And we've been wanting to hear how we can improve that service. I'd like to pose a question to you to think about as you're going through the various working group presentations, and then bring the question into your breakouts and then finally into the survey. What is that question? We'd like you to think about what are the key messages arising out of the themes, the patterns, and the synergies you've been noticing from the workshop and the working group reports. What are the needs of your community? What are the needs expressed more broadly by the workshop? And how would you set those priorities? And so with that question posed, think about it as we go through, and when we get to the breakouts, Ben will, I'm sure, go over it with you again. The latter half of the agenda is really a synthesis process. Having heard all of the presentations, we now want to ask, what did we see that was the same? What was different? What was important? And that's the synthesis discussions, which will lead ultimately to recommendations of the plenary. These are the first input to the recommendations. And then as we move through the next few days, the conference organizers, the workshop organizers will synthesize the recommendations and bring them to you at the final plenary, which is next Wednesday. We inserted something of an experiment. We've been experimenting with virtual meetings, and that's in the area of what I called pictures at an exhibition. We'd like to collect pictures that you think express best practices or show people implementing best practices, or maybe somebody just scratching their head, because after all, that's part of it also. And so we're creating something or an opportunity called Jamboard, and Ben will explain it to you later, in which you can contribute your pictures, your thoughts to us as a visual to complement all of the words that you're running into as we go through the various proceedings and minutes of meetings. Finally, we'll close at the end of today. I would like to acknowledge the contributions of the working group, and in particular, also the contributions of the moderators here and the moderators tomorrow, all of whom have made significant contributions. So let's talk about us. The workshop, we had about 270 people each day. Having planned for 150 people total and 600 plus registered, this was an interesting experience. But we're very pleased with the geographic breadth of the distribution and the willingness of people to join us on unusual time zones, including, of course, tonight. The fact is that those are just points on a graph, points on a map. That's not it. What's really it are you, all of the people that made the contributions. And these are some of the screenshots that I took over the duration of the meeting. We have many more. And for that, I'd like to thank all of you. And let's move into the discussions and the presentations. With that, let me stop sharing. And I'd like to introduce Kimberley Baldry, who will run the first session. Kimberley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jay. So to start off with, we just wanted to say that if you'd like your screen shared presenters, please drop your presentations into the link that Ben's going to post in the chat. Otherwise, send a message in the chat saying if you need co-host capabilities to share your screen. We won't take questions because we're going to break out into groups at the end, and we'll be ringing 2 bells, I think, one at 1 minute, letting you know you have 1 minute left to finish your presentation, and one at 30 seconds. And we're going to be quite strict with time because we don't have a lot of it to play around with. So first up, we have the fisheries group, which will be presented by Cisco Werner.
Great, thanks, Kimberly. And I think Marino is going to be uploading the file, please.
Sure thing. I'll upload to the Google Drive now.
Okay.
Cisco, will you share or shall we?
I think, Marino, can you tell us what you're doing? I'm sorry. Marino is either sharing the file or he's sending it to you.
Yeah, I've just uploaded to the shared drive link that was in the chat box, so it should be there now.
So just a reminder, we'll give you a bell at the 5 minute mark and then at the 6 minute and 30 second mark if you're still going. And when you hear that second bell, that's your cue to wrap up so we can stay more or less on time.
All right.
Okay, Kimberly, it's saying that it's on the shared drive as summaries, fisheries, WG2 PDF.
Ben, are you sharing or do I need?
Not is sharing.
I can do that, yeah.
Brilliant.
Then there are questions of whether you have to be a co-host in order to share your screen.
Did not
Maybe.
need to be a co-host.
Okay, I'll
And
respond.
screen. So as much as possible, if you want to share during your own presentation, that will probably help us go smoothly and more quickly if you're ready. But we're happy to support you if you need that.
Okay. I'm also able to share then, if that's the case.
Great. Yeah, if you can, you want to just go? Let's do it.
Sure.
Great. Thanks very much, everybody. My name is Cisco Werner. I'm with NOAA Fisheries, and with Peter Haugen and Marino Wichman, we co-hosted the series of working group meetings on fisheries. I will say this is the first time any of us actually had a chance to work with best practices. So for us, it was a bit of a learning experience and actually a very pleasant one, and we'll share a little bit about the things that we talked about. The next slide shows the sessions that we held. Fisheries, we focused on wild capture fisheries. We're going to leave aquaculture for a recommendation for a future workshop. And when you do wild capture fisheries, there's three main components. One is data collection. There's then, once you have the data, you generate stock assessments. So you do the quantitative analysis of the data you collected, and then you ultimately provide advice. And those three sessions are the ones that is how we structured the workshops. And then today we had a summary that led to the presentation I'm going to walk through you or through with you today. It's so late I can't even talk. The next slide. As I said, since we were new to the best practices discussions, we started by asking ourselves, so what can we do? And so we thought, well, let's think about how we can give people a leg up, help or shortcuts in terms of what works, knowing what things have been tried and tested and might help right decisions. But at the same time, we emphasize that there's still a lot of science to be done, and we should challenge conventional thinking. So we didn't pretend that we would offer any final answers in terms of best practices. We thought about convergence of methods, which meant that perhaps this is something that we could use to integrate across working methods. But also, we also needed to continue thinking about how we could do things differently. Again, the emphasis here being an evolving science and an evolving set of approaches. And then finally, developing standardized and transparent quality assured processes. So something that's backed by clear science reasoning and well-documented practices, but also recognizing that requirements vary regionally and societal focus also changes. And so again, we must remain adaptive. So with that as a backdrop, we launched into day one, which was the data collection day. And we started discussing that, pointing out that fisheries is in general scale and region dependent. You can be very advanced locally and have everything worked out. You can, grow a little bit bigger and go regional. There's a lot of progress that's been made in regional, say, shelf scale domains and such. And then you can even scale up beyond that, which would be global. And that's something that's really, in a nascent stage in terms of thinking about fisheries in a global context. And we do have groups like the FAO, and this the picture here of the book there is an example of an organization that is devoted really to pretty much all of these scales, and it would be a natural partner to bring into discussion in OBPS since they this is something that they're actually quite good at in many ways. The next slide says what are the messages that came out of the data collection discussions. Recognizing that there are these differences in scales, one of the things that we could do is work towards stitching these together and use either different measurements or modeling approaches that allow us to generate a more complete, say, global picture, and links with omics groups, unmanned systems, and ourselves, fisheries, would make sense. The importance of metadata follows. It's important in the sense of allowing us to connect across data sets, the whole aspect of interoperability. Big data was something we talked about in terms of the really large and growingly increasing amounts of data that we collect, whether it's genetic data or acoustic data and so on. And so we think that linking with satellite communities with best practices for how do you deal with massive data sets, all of which reinforced by the FAIR principles that we know of. Next slide.
That's you have 2 minutes left.
Okay. That then goes into, the data goes into models, and models can be used to provide trends and control rules and forecasts that then link with management implications, which then goes to the recommendations, next slide, that we talked about. What best practices come out of stock assessments? As I said, there's a host of stock assessment models. Best practices should make use of repositories such as OBPS. But at the same time, there should be recognition that there's a capacity development requirement to take advantage of the host of models that are out there. And as we make models more complicated, again, because of the increase in data and data availability and so on, community modeling approaches and best practices in that using GitHub and others came to mind, as well as the development of what we refer to as management strategy evaluations, which is really bringing together stakeholders in science and science objectives to make the final decisions. Next slide. And in terms of the management best practices, it's, you know, if you look at the left side of the chart here, you're trying to find the right answer. And in doing so, if you look at the left side, you have to make sure that you get there the right way and not wind up making errors because you didn't include uncertainties or you didn't include the proper stakeholder buy-in and such. So it's a balance between, you know, getting the right answer and making sure that, oops, that was pretty fast. I'll try to wrap up in a minute. In the management advice thing, then the recommendations that came out was the importance of dialogue is fundamental. You know, establishing clear management objectives, documentation, using best science, strive for advice, for consensus or consensus advice, stakeholder buy-in, ecosystem approaches, and climate change. These are all the things that we're working on. Next slide. So we know it's a complex problem, diverse from industrialized to artisanal. Transparency is key. You know, we need to continue developing best practices for ecosystem management and then really embrace all of these new technologies that are coming in. And in summary,
Right. Thank you, Cisco. I think we're going to have to cut you off there. Is there one final sentence you want to say?
where we want to go, we need to work with you guys and get ahead in the ocean decade implications. We hope to write a short paper documenting this, and we'd like to recommend aquaculture for a future workshop. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Next up, we have Mackenzie Mazar, who is presenting on the ethics working group.
Thank you. I can share my screen. Okay. All right. So I'm presenting on behalf of the ethics working group. Michelle Barbier, Fred Worski, and Tobias Hahn are also part of this working group, but it's very early in the morning for Michelle and Tobias right now, so I'll be presenting on behalf of the group. And so I'd like to start with technology has no ethics, but humans do. And so a lot of things that involve humans involves ethics. And so the ethics working group really is related to a lot of the other working groups in OBPS as well. And ethics are about humans, specifically ethics are about respect for human freedom, dignity, equality and solidarity, citizens' rights, and justice. And so we focus on applied ethics, which define how to implement principles and core values related to ocean observation. Applied ethics provide guidance and ensures no negative long-term global impacts. And they provide principles that address past power imbalances. And so as ocean observers, we should be responsible for ethical science. And so one of our sessions was on engaging Indigenous communities in ocean research. A summary from that session was that to successfully and ethically work with Indigenous communities, you need to have a co-designed approach, respect cultural differences, reach agreements and objectives of the research, and follow the OCAP principles, which focus on ownership, control, access, and possession of information regarding Indigenous communities. And our next session was about fisheries and ethics, specifically focusing on transparency and collaboration with stakeholders. And so we suggested some approaches to address transparency and collaboration, such as clear science communication, stakeholders taking part in knowledge production, addressing internal conflicts between stakeholders, extensive discussions, participatory modeling, ethical matrices and pedigree matrices that help identify ethical concerns, surveys on transparency, and some methods such as structured decision-making and management strategy evaluation, and collaborative monitoring, which really involves stakeholders in the scientific process. And so also during our discussion, We found that scientists getting feedback from stakeholders on methods and results is an important practice, and keeping stakeholders in the scientific process, not just at the end, but at the beginning as well, is important. And our next session was on ethics in optimizing ocean observing infrastructure. And so it was discussed that ocean observing occurs at either coordinated international sustained efforts or short-term one-off projects. And so both types of information are important for the ocean that we want, relating to the UN Ocean Decade. And we discussed that the resources invested in observing infrastructure could generate much more diverse and useful information to many different groups if access to the infrastructure was systematically shared. And we also discussed that we have a responsibility to culturally change to better use these publicly funded infrastructures. And so some other tips we discussed were, when an ethical issue is raised, it's first a good practice would be first to check the existing legislation or rules that exist. And when you face an ethical issue, think about the long-term impact to help decide on what decision, help decide the best methods to take. So for example, ethical issues such as the use of existing data from oil drilling, whale hunting, or some other unethical experiments could be discussed with an ethics community to help decide on the best approach. And so we also came up with some ethical recommendations going forward. The first being to design a flowchart that observers can consult to identify potential ethical issues related to their research. Since ethical issues depend on the context a lot, a flowchart is really useful in identifying ethical research practices. And this can help create awareness among research and end users to provide some key points that can be answered when perhaps best practice documents are submitted. And this will help form some ethical recommendations to specific research questions. And so the idea we had is when a best practice is submitted, a flowchart could appear that has some different questions related to ethics. And so we have a draft of this available on our Google Drive, and the link is available in our PowerPoint. And we're still working on this draft, and we're open to feedback and improving this draft. Does that mean I have 2 minutes? Okay,
Yeah.
I'll go a little bit faster. So the second recommendation was to support the implementation of an ethics committee in the ocean observing community. And this is related to the UN Ocean Decade. It has some overlap there. And this committee would consist of members with different expertises and have meetings that are, when appropriate. Our third recommendation was to design a statement for ocean observers that highlight ethical responsibilities. We also have a draft of this available on our Google Drive, and we welcome feedback on this. Our fourth recommendation is to organize applied ethics courses that are not specifically, they're specifically dedicated to ocean observation, but they're not just about research integrity, but also about other aspects of ethics and science as well. And our fifth recommendation is to open a clearinghouse of information where you can find non-scientific information, such as things that relate to legal aspects, such as legislation. So when you're wondering, what do you need to know when you're working in a community, you can find it here. And this is an example of such a clearinghouse, and the link is in this PowerPoint. We're also working on a special issue for ocean sciences and ethics. And I'd like to end with Michelle's contact information. If you have any questions, you can contact Michelle, the lead of the working group. And also thank all the participants for the really great discussion over the last several days. I think we all got to know each other really well, and we had some really fun discussions, and I learned a lot myself.
Thank you, Mackenzie. That was very tight with timing. So next we have my favorite working group, Ocean Uncertainty Quantification, and Mark Bushnell is going to present for that.
I'll unmute myself and share my screen.
Brilliant.
So I'll start by pointing out that we really had a great team with 5 co-leads. I think we had the largest group of all working groups, and we had excellent support, and it was a real pleasure to be working with these folks. We started out by listing our individual goals for the Ocean UQ session, and this is a distilled list that, thank you, Kim, she put it together, and it's still extensive, and it's became pretty obvious to us early on that ocean uncertainty has got the same working space as ocean best practice system. It's you know, the full value chain and across all variables and observing techniques, platforms, products, and I guess that's true for all of the cross-theme working groups. No need to read each one of these in detail. They're just there for reference, and they're in all of our working documents too. So here's a list of the 12 presentations that we had, and the words in bold are simply there to show you the diversity of the presentations that we had. We had the same theme throughout. We had 4 gatherings, a total of 6 hours, and peaked at 26 members. We usually had over 20, which was a pretty good showing, I thought. And here are some significant outcomes. It became clear that we all agreed the terminology needs work. Now, there are entire documents written to the verbiage for Ocean UQ, but that doesn't mean people use it in a continuous way. And so one of the goals you'd like to do is to have people at least acknowledge that ocean uncertainty quantification is necessary and use the same words when they're talking about it. We actually had a very good point from a metrologist who said, don't get hung up on the words. It's the idea that you're trying to convey information with a single quantification value. And as long as you convey that information correctly, don't get wrapped around the axle with the words. We saw some overlap with other working groups. With convergence, it's obvious that UQ should be a standard operating procedure. With data management, the quantification uncertainty value becomes a part of the metadata. And we noted that although it's known that all values should have a quality flag, but they're simple but in design by design. But if you include a uncertainty quantification value with that, you've really magnified the value of the data. And then, of course, developing and training, we found several instances where there's a good overlap, leveraging to be carried out. And so these are the recommendations from our working group to the Ocean Best Practice System. These are, we have about 3 dozen altogether, and some of them were specific to a variable like HF radar. Some were general for all uncertainty quantification efforts. These are the ones that we felt applied specifically to the Ocean Best Practice System. And it on the very first session, very first presentation, we confirmed that there's good coordination to be conducted between the Ocean Best Practice System and US CLIVAR effort. The Southern Ocean Observing System is working to develop user tools for uncertainty quantification, so there's an opportunity there. This requirements for uncertainty quantification and oceanography best practice. It's a kind of a no-brainer. I kind of think of it as the best practice for best practice paper that was recently written. This is the same kind of thing, best practice for uncertainty quantification. And so on, no need to go into the details of the rest of them. So I'll close by thanking our speakers. They really were a wonderful group. They all uploaded their presentations on time. They stuck to their time during the presentation. We had great Q&A after them. A real pleasure, and my hat's off to every one of them. And that's the end.
All right, thank you, Mark. So next up we have the Omics or Environmental DNA Working Group, and Katie Pitts is going to present that.
I'll just share my screen. Okay, great. Hi, I'm Katie Pitts, and I'm with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And I'd like to start off with thanking all my fellow leads for this session, and also all the participants. It's been a very exciting week full of good discussions. So first off, what do we mean by omics? Well, we discussed its molecular measurement of data. So we discussed everything from genomics to transcriptomics to proteomics and metabolomics. But we kind of broke the week up into the basic pipeline, from samples to bioinformatics and analysis to data and information stewardship, and then also a day talking about society. And on the last 2 days, the data and information stewardship, we co-hosted with the data working group. And on the society day, we actually co-hosted with the ethics working group and the data working group. Whoops. So our first day, when we discussed samples, we talked about, why do some groups not publish their protocols? Well, we're working in a space where we have this rapidly evolving technology. So oftentimes you can feel that these protocols are changing very quickly. And so we also talked about what could motivate our community to share protocols, kind of methods, carrot versus stick methods. So oftentimes we benefit from others sharing their protocols, so training, and we could also have a top-down approach where institutions or journals require people to share their protocols in a more detailed format than just in a paper. And also we could give recognition to people who have done a thorough job in documenting their protocols. So what would we want from the ocean best practice system? Version control came up a lot, and a high level of detail in protocols. So in a kind of 2 to 10 year vision, we could see templates for publishing protocols to enable better comparisons, comparing one protocol to another. Also an idea for a decision tree. So depending on your research question and the type of data that you have, you could kind of walk your way through the protocols that are available. And so in our second day, we moved on to talking about bioinformatics pipelines and analysis that we do with our data. And so one important thing for this aspect is sharing actually the code that people use to analyze their data, because this helps us with reproducibility of our science, and also helps with teaching of methods, best practice methods to others, and also gives recognition for a lot of hard work that goes into developing code. And we also thought that journals could do a better job requiring the publishing of all code that goes into a manuscript. So when we thought about what kinds of metadata would be essential to go with the code, there are some good tools that are coming out where we can link software versions and dependencies all together to help people to make it easier for others to reproduce the kinds of analysis that we've done. And so on our next day, we then talked about data and information stewardship. So this session was co-hosted with the data working group. And here it's talking about how better can our community share our data. So how can we comply with fair data standards? And we think that as a community, we're doing a better job with our kind of sequence data, our raw data forms. So kind of the data that comes back from the sequencing facility, for example. But we do less well with kind of our intermediate data products. And we're actually doing not that well. We're not doing well at all with our metadata, which is really essential for sharing data. And so we talked about what relevant standards exist and how we could make these standards easier to implement and reward people for actually using these metadata standards. So providing, for example, recognition through citations. And how can the ocean best practice systems improve our culture of data stewardship for the omics cDNA community? we thought that it could provide a lot of resources in training and outreach and advocating for using these metadata and data standards, and also help to coordinate between different countries and regions where different groups are working on this issue, but we need to improve our coordination and communication with each other. So for our final Society Day, today we started off with a survey where we asked people if they had ever heard of these different ethics standards before, and we were a little surprised that a lot of people had never heard of several of these, and those who had heard it mentioned but maybe didn't understand in depth. And the Nagoya Protocol was the most well-known and applied of these different standards. And so we talked about the intersection between ethical, legal, and social issues with eDNA data. Oh, thank you. And so this applies not just for sampling, but all the way through the pipeline, from sampling to data sharing, and to how we communicate our data with policyholders, and how we educate and train others to be able to take these kinds of samples around the world. So we held some other additional meetings on other topics, one from autonomous technologies to the need for biobanking and to increase communication. And so these were kind of the recurring themes that we found throughout our week, that we need better metadata. It would be nice to have decision trees to indicate to people maybe just getting started, what are the applicable protocols they should follow, that OBPS can really help us with training and outreach. And then it can also be a place for encouraging coordination between different groups who are working in these different areas. And so our preliminary recommendations are that OBPS can really support this kind of network of network approach, where we take groups that are working on these different systems and help to coordinate them. So systems for metadata standards that ease compliance with these standards, that build incentives, and that will help us with training and outreach. And so we also thought, in terms of a big goal for the Ocean Decade, is we could try to have a globally coordinated OMIC and eDNA action that could help mobilize our community and accelerate the development of a lot of our recommendations, and it could connect these national and regional programs. So that's all. And I'd like to thank everyone.
All right, thank you, Katie, that was great. And finally for this session, we have Megan Cronin, who's going to present for the surface radiation group.
Thanks. And if you can show the slides. Okay, so while you're getting that going, we had 2 sessions, Tuesday morning and Wednesday morning for an hour and a half each, and then a bonus session today, this morning. At our 2 briefings, we had about 30 people participating, which I thought was a very good showing. And with 5 briefings on the first day, followed by a roundtable, and 4 briefings on the second day with a roundtable. And then during the bonus session, we had about 20 people, and we were talking about synthesizing it and getting this talk together and thinking about how we're going to write the paper and reports. In retrospect, I think that we should have had more sessions and longer times really to get it, because we covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time. Tomorrow, so I'm Megan Cronin, and tomorrow the early career ocean professional is going to be speaking, Maria Teresa Guerrera, and so I'm really proud of her for being willing to step up and give this presentation. Once, you know, we just made this presentation today, so okay. And so next slide. There's a lot of challenges with making surface radiation measurements. There's shadows and reflections for solar radiation, and warm and cold objects in the field of view can contaminate the IR measurements. If the platform is moving, that can change the zenith angle of the solar direct beam and therefore contaminate or give you a wrong measurement. And motion due to wind can cause mean tilts in the platform, waves can rock the platform, and then if it's like a ship or a autonomous surface vehicle or a plane, obviously the platform can move around as it's navigating, and that can cause tilts that can change the effective zenith angle, and therefore the measured direct solar beam. There's other challenges. There's the signals are very small, and you have to amplify it and digitize these very small voltages to get and you have to get accurate measurements of the thermistors. In fact, that challenge right there is an overwhelming challenge for many developing countries and new observing groups. And so that's an impediment that we want to try to overcome. There's also environmental contamination of the optics from dust and dew and ice, sea salt, guano, and bird butts, and all sorts of stuff. And finally, the calibration reference is not always available, and also it might be a poor quality. Factory cals are not as good as a calibration done that is traceable to an outdoor calibration done that's traceable to the international standard. Next slide. And so what did we do? We came up with a strategy about how to go forward. The first thing is to compile a list of papers showing performance statistics from different sensors and best practices based upon the land-based networks. The land networks are a very mature systems, and the ocean community and the land community have thus far not really talked to each other. And so we have a lot to learn. The ocean community has a lot to learn by just going into the literature of the land-based networks. We plan to develop a decision tree for the choice of sensors, and we plan to develop best practices for making these measurements. We have a proposal to expand land-based calibration facilities to handle ocean-based sensor systems. And we also saw briefings from some some very well maintained platforms that were right next to a land-based network that was really well maintained. And that would then provide a test bed that we could do some ocean land intercomparisons for other types of platforms. And finally, we want to write this report and a peer-reviewed paper. And so we put names today by every one of these bullet items, as well as bullet items on the next couple of slides. So you can go to the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, okay, so now the first step here is the decision tree for primary and ancillary sensors. First thing, is it a biological application? Okay, then you go to this decision tree. Is it a heat budget application? Go to this other decision tree. Are you measuring downwelling solar and IR radiation? Okay, then you do these. If you're measuring upwelling IR, then you need to be measuring the skin temperature of the ocean. We'll send you to another decision tree. What do you do if how do you measure the upwelling solar? That's the albedo. Many of us, most of us, nearly everyone doesn't measure that. And so what do you do then? Or if you are going to measure it, what sensors do you need to measure that? Okay, are you power limited or not? Are you on a ship or a buoy or what? That will affect what your setup and your sensors are going to be. Is your platform stable, but to what degree or not? That will also make you have a different type of a sensor and setup? Does it have a mean tilt, say due to winds, or a variable tilt due to waves or navigation? You're going to need to have a different sensor and setup. Are you on ice or near ice, and how cold? Then you need a different sensor. So you can see it's really complicated. And we're going to try to kind of give order to this. Now,
Megan,
yeah.
Sorry to interject. Yeah, you've run out of time. Would you like to provide a summary sentence to finish up?
Yeah. Okay. So we have developed the best practices here. And if you go to the next, our main point is that we need to connect to the land-based network. And so that's it, really. And this is really urgent if you go to the last one, just because the network is expanding very rapidly. And we think that this network can be not only bigger, but it could be better through adopting these best practices. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Megan. So we're going to have a break. I think we're still going to try and come back 55, whatever the hour is in your time zone.
5 minutes before the top of the hour, so it'll be about a 6-minute break. Yep.
Okay, yeah. So people will be presenting when we come back.
All right.
Or moderating, yeah.
How about a little music while we chill out?
Really strict about time. And I'd like to first welcome Leah Segui to talk about the Sargassum Group.
You can see my screen? Can you hear me? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
good.
So I'm Leah Segui. I'm representing the Sargassum Working Group. And if you don't know what sargassum is and what the problem is, just to give you a brief overview. So sargassum is a type of algae that floats in the ocean. And since 2011, it's been creating these massive algal blooms that stretch all the way from West Africa to the Caribbean. And when it lands on shore, it can pile like as tall as people. So this has a really big impact on coastal communities. And so we came together to discuss kind of the information gaps and how best practices could help with figuring out what to do with sargassum. So our sessions included science and technology. On Tuesday, UNEP hosted a webinar about the West Africa perspective on sargassum. Wednesday, we had monitoring and forecasting. And then earlier today, we talked about management. And so just a brief overview of the community needs that we covered. We've heard a lot that there is a lot of basic science that's missing. And so there's been many entrepreneurs that have tried to create businesses using sargassum, but we still don't know a lot about how frequently it's coming in what volume, and what the quality is. When we think about the science, we need to make sure that it's related to sargassum's impact on people. And we also need to know guidelines, enforceable regulations, and management practices that are relevant to the different countries that are impacted, because each country is going to have a different management priority. And so what types of information could help get them to those goals? We heard that there needs to be more sharing of information across the Atlantic, and that there have been a lot of webinars about sargassum already. And so what the community really needs are concrete actions moving forward. We spent some time talking about the decade, and we said that private-public partnerships may be the way forward. So instead of basic scientists fighting against the pharmaceutical industry for funding, maybe the decade is an opportunity for these different sectors to come together and move forward. We also talked about interactions with about ethics, and maybe the decade is a way to bring more of those conversations to be included in the science. And then the decade is also a way for groups to come together to seek funding collaboratively. And so because this is a region and really a basin-wide problem, how could we all come together and work with the same pot of money? And then lastly, this could be a way to bring the West African region and the Caribbean together to share lessons learned. And then we have, I split it into two different groups of recommendations to ocean best practices that would serve our community. And the first theme is about advertising. So we talked about how the private sector is really the ones making strides in sargassum research. So they are the ones trying to turn this into a business or paying for cleanup methods to save their business. And so since they are already interacting with sargassum and they have a lot of information that they're not sharing, maybe ocean best practices is a venue to bring them into the conversation. And since there is all this unused, unshared data, we need to talk about rules about publishing and sharing that information. We also highlighted the need to integrate social science. So to hear not only from science, but we want to incorporate community engagement and local knowledge into best practices. And lastly, we talked about how there's been a lot of science and some misinformation coming out over the last decade as to why this is happening. And so how can we vet information so that we're getting the proper information to decision makers and the broader community? And then the second part of this conversation is how we can organize our sargassum management tag on ocean best practices. And so we talked about other information that could be useful, like how much a best practice could cost, so that people could decide whether or not it's right for them. We found with the documents that are already online for sargassum that they're not necessarily best practice because as a community, we still have to figure out what organizations could vet them and what that process could look like. And so we thought maybe that we could have a labeling process so that it's easy for people to see which communities have been involved in that vetting process and I guess what kind of approval rating they've gotten. And so one way we thought about doing it is to create something like a traffic light approach. So coming up with some sort of label that shows good, better, and best practices. And so this will just be dependent on the user and what their capacity is to be able to use a certain practice. So that's a very quick run through of our week. We have a lot more information in our notes, but I just want to say thank you to our speakers and to our working group participants because we couldn't have had any of this information and any of these dialogues without you. So thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Leah. And now I'm going to throw across to the Ocean Partnership Building Group with Johanna Dua, who's talking about developing training and guidance. Before I do, I will apologise if I've mispronounced anyone's names. I'm new to this community, so thank you all. Johanna.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me now? All right. Thank you very much, Pip. So I'm Johanna Diwa for the Working Group on Developing Training and Guidance Materials. Can you run my PowerPoint, Nanad?
Just a sec.
Sorry, yeah. Because sharing screen is really going to affect my internet connectivity. So.
What's the session name? Work group name?
Sorry, that's the training. So the summary training WG file in the folder.
Okay, in a moment.
It has Johanna as the author and as the owner.
Yes, I got it.
Yes. Anyway, so I'm presenting on behalf of our group with Peter Peterson, Sherry Swartz, and Abby Alela, and also with support from the SG-OBPS members, Claudia Delgado and Ana Lara. So, okay, let me just get started so we can save time. We welcomed about 30 participants in the 3 sessions that we organized this week. We had a session on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and guided by the scope of discussion, our group addressed the following questions. I am going to present the results of the discussion under each question. So yeah, maybe we can, next please. We can start with, yes, next please. So the questions that we addressed in our group included the following. Are there existing training programs related to ocean best practices that you're currently engaged with or aware of? So basically it's a crowdsourcing of information and as a consultative process, asking the inputs from our participants in the group. Who are the target user groups of OBPS training? What capacity development methodologies can promote the wider use of OBPs? What existing tools, resources, or platforms can be utilized? What best practices in e-learning are there? How can non-scientific communities and practitioners get engaged in the creation, adoption, and routine employment of best practices? And the challenges and potential pitfalls in the process. So next, please. Let me now present the results of the discussion under question. The first question, our group noted the Ocean Teacher Global Academy, POGO Summer Schools, UNOLS, RV Tech Technician Training Subcommittee that works to provide marine technician training to UNOLS technicians. Another program is in the US is MATE internship, providing students with hands-on shipboard intern experience, IOCCP, Biogeochemical Sensor Training Course, and ITIC, International Tsunami Information Center. Reference was also made to an online survey that attempted to map existing OBPS-related training and CD programs around the world. The preliminary results revealed that most initiatives offer short courses, workshops, courses towards bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees, followed by ship-based training. In terms of subject areas, most courses related to data management, followed by sensor use and QC, AZ, and product development. Now, looking at ELV scores, they focused mainly on subsurface temperature, subsurface salinity, phytoplankton mass, and diversity, oxygen, etc. Next slide, please. As for the target user groups of OBPS training, the group noted that the target audiences are mainly students, educators, professionals working in the ocean, ECOPs, national and state government officials, disaster management authorities, industry, local community, ocean-going technicians. In addition, it was felt that regional information centers, GUS regional alliances, programs and projects such as IODE, Ocean Info Hub, AtlantoWest, ODIP should be considered as target audiences as well. Next, please. On the capacity development methodologies, there was an overwhelming preference for online learning, probably because of the COVID-19 environment. Online courses can reach large audiences across geographic boundaries. The group, however, noted that for topics that require hands-on laboratory or technical work, a fully online approach will not work. Especially hands-on experience on board the research vessel is essential and is not easily replaced. However, in this regard, the use of virtual reality was mentioned. It was concluded that a variety of methodologies need to be considered depending on the subject and expected results of the training. And there should be some best practices development on how to be successful online. Also, it might be an option to do an online course with theory and background and then one-on-one coaching sessions that allow trainees to address research goals and objectives. These types of coaching sessions have been piloted with different research groups and might be able to provide with funding Wow, that's fast. So let me.
Give me
Yeah.
2 more minutes. So,
All right,
we had the
2 more minutes. Okay, and then OTGA is also an example of a model that can be used for online training in a formal course. Next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, there's mention of MOOCs as a great resource, and also mentoring and peer-to-peer relevant methodologies. Courses need to be provided in language relevant to the target audience. Face-to-face courses were considered, but limited to few participants and relatively expensive. And internships in labs are also important and should be encouraged. Next, please. On the existing tools, resources, and platforms, there were mention of infographics, videos, manuals, tools, toolkits, handbooks, and games. It was noted that, I'm sorry? Okay. Anyway, it was noted that various monitoring networks have established best practices and that OBPS could contribute to the development of toolkits that include BP guidelines, manuals, videos. Yeah, I think we're previous. Yeah, one more slide. And okay, so let's go to number 5 on best practices. Number 5, please. Previous slide. Anyway, so does that mean I have 30 more seconds or 1 minute?
Yeah, 30 seconds.
Okay. So yeah, so I think I want to emphasize number 6, please, on how non-scientific communities and practitioners can get engaged in the creation, adoption, and routine employment of best practices. There's mention of citizen science initiatives and also involving young people, NGOs, scientific societies. There's mention of community engagement and research community and co-designing best practices with policymakers as well. Next, please. An important, okay, and sorry, next, please. On challenges and pitfalls, I think these are very important. Here are the challenges, mostly sustainability and funding, and resources such as internet connectivity, platform, and language. Next, please. I would like to end, and here are the pitfalls. We need to be careful not to force BPs, and also that people can get very much overwhelmed with best practices. So the practical best practices suggestion really makes sense. Now, if I may finish this with the action items in the next slide, please. Okay, we also identify several action items.
Pull this down to 1 sentence by any chance, please?
So yeah, basically these are the action items that we would like to propose to the OBPS. Basically, creation of toolkit and the making them available in the OTGA, as well as the developing best practices on stakeholder engagement. And yeah, if I can go to the last slide, that's best practices on compendium on the subject of virtual reality, and including courses on applied ethics, as mentioned by the ethics working group earlier. And of course, more funding is needed to support OBPS training and capacity development. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Joanna. I'm going to throw straight to the fisheries group with who were talking about ocean partnership building, and we have a recording from Maya Delaney.
And do we have that recording?
Of course we do.
All right.
I'm hoping that Nenad has the recording there ready to go.
Actually not.
Oh,
Ben?
I might have cut Joanna off unnecessarily then.
Jay, do you know if that was sent to us or uploaded somewhere? It's not in our sharing folder.
It's not clear it was uploaded or that it was prepared. So we should move on.
Okay, Pierluigi Buttigieg, are you ready to go if we move you up the agenda a little?
Sure.
Thank you very much. So Pierluigi is going to talk about the data and information group. And I have you listed as talking about sargassum as well here. Pierluigi, is that correct?
I mean, I could say things about sargassum. They'll all be wrong, but I can say them. No, so I'm not a sargassum.
maybe we'll stick to the data and information management then.
Yeah, for the best, I think. Right. So yeah, our group talked a great deal. We have about a 40-page document in terms of our session notes with great insights from our participants. The participants that we do have, there are many. Lots of institutes to acknowledge, lots of people to acknowledge. Can't do it here, but inside our KikoChat space, you can go to our working group report, where you can find the information on our participants. And that's where our final report to the OBPS will be generated, as in the other sessions too. So our motivation is to think about the next best practice for writing best practices in such a way that they can interface with the world of data, information, and digital knowledge that's coming up on the horizon, so that we'll move away from a world of PDFs into one of machine-readable content that can help us find exactly the methodologies and standards and guidelines that we need rapidly to meet needs that we don't even know exist yet. And so that we can link those bits in the document to marine data stores, EOVs, you name it. Part of that logic is in a document that was mentioned previously, a best practice for writing best practices that is available. My colleague, Jem, has just placed the link in the chat for you to check that out for more details on that. So this is an ongoing synthesis. I'm just presenting what our group has co-prioritized. So we went through our notes, and you see the color coding there. And we'll present some of the high priority items in this session, but we will be synthesizing that into the working group report. So our recommendations, this is our alpha version for our recommendations for the OBPS. The first chunk is a broad ranging list of questions that we asked. And here's how we think the OBPS can place itself in the digital ocean ecosystem that's emerging as part of the decade. We did ask our early career ocean professionals first, since they're on the front line, so to speak, of innovation, what the OBPS should elevate. And really, the need to share data rapidly, best practices in terms of managing career paths, for managing reward structures to get content out there quickly, was mentioned as something that's very key, very important. The best practices or guidelines trying to elevate content which helps people manage the digital stewards themselves so that they feel more like a community that can talk to one another and boost interoperability that way. And leverages how automated systems can fast track data that's usually kept in archives for a long time into more real-time systems. So those are very important perspectives that I think will accelerate the relationship of the OBPS to the digital landscape. How do we actually link these methods? There are many ways. But the main thing here, the main concept here, is get those methods, standards, guidelines, best practices digitized with fair, compliant metadata associated with them, and with ways that the machine can look inside it. Version control was also mentioned, that really as those best practices or documents of any kind, methodological documents of any kind evolve, those can be linked to the versions of code and other things that are out there. Right, once that happens, we can start accelerating convergence, which we'll hear about and from other working groups, in little communities of practice to then globalize methodology. So again, to boost interoperability, that's the key theme, right? How do we, and then another theme explored there that was voted up was how do we actually bridge these ultra technical communities to decision makers, policy developers, the public, etc. And how can the OBPS help? Well, really elevate the resources that can train the people at those interfaces to do so. Focus on digital communication skills, digital diplomacy. There are lots of now fields that require high data literacy. And if we can highlight those, we train the people, and the people will then generate better best practices, better practices, and feedback into the system. So we'd like to create that dynamic. How do we actually integrate the narrative documents with code bases that are being developed? This was also mentioned in the fisheries just earlier. Well, again, the version control system is key, that the version control of the narrative document is linked to the version control of the code. So they develop with each other, and machines know which one to reference to the other with persistent identifiers. Also, in that consideration, we have to think about how to respect intellectual property, the CARE principles, and OCAP to be careful that permissions are secured and licenses are clear. We also asked what's not on our radar. Well, there are things that are coming in the next decade that are going to be real issues for us to deal with. So we have to think about how to protect our systems from fake data, even fake methods, who knows? There will be a lot of information-based mischief happening in the future. So that's something that we would take on board as a long-term strategy in the OBPS. Also, we have to think about things like data sovereignty, localization, and residency, which will also be pertinent to the methodologies linked to that data. Know-how is going to be capital, in a sense. So we did discuss this with the ethics working group in some crosstalk between our Slack spaces, and that's been a very, very interesting conversation that we can open up later. Another theme is how do we align digital strategies? Many places are writing high-level digital strategies, digital policies that are actually quite hard to implement because they're very high level. The people writing the code are sort of curious, how do we actually make this happen in practice? So on that, how can the OBPS help there? Well, if we gather up those documents, and there are many of them, we listed many in our session notes, gather them up, why are there so many, where are the overlaps, link them together, and try to help them refine into more, let's say, a gradient of high-level to low-level recommendations so that strategies can be implemented more clearly. And again, the solutions will actually talk to each other rather than simply operating on a more idealistic level, shall we say. So again, once those things are made machine readable, which was part of the strategy, and it's nice to see that reinforced, natural language processing and text mining can help us with semantic technologies that we already use, can help us identify how to bring those documents together more efficiently as the number grows, which it certainly will. The last thing was how can we promote methods that will help us move data up the chain from data to information to knowledge or digital knowledge that's needed to fuel economies, that's needed to fuel science, that's needed to fuel society. Again, there's an encouragement of elevation of content. So again, we recognize the OBPS cannot create the content, but indeed we can see if we can elevate things that will help people understand the difference between data, information, and knowledge in different settings, and also the value of different levels of quality control. So data that might not make it to a scientific publication can still really help a societal goal. And it's important that that data is not lost or discarded, but fed into the appropriate spot in the digital ecosystem emerging. Those sort of methods that show, or case studies that show how data was worked up into knowledge, those are very important to expose to the community. And perhaps working with the Frontier special issue linked to the OBPS, we can make that a little bit more clear so that people see this in action and see the success stories. And also see the failures.
Excuse me, sorry, I'm going to butt in. Sure. You're out of time. Can I get you to wrap up?
Yes, of course. Sure.
Thank you.
There, that was it actually.
Oh, thank you very much for that then. We might pass straight on to Artur Palach, who's talking about marine litter and plastics.
So hi all, can you just let me know if you can see the screen?
We can indeed, thank you.
All right, great. So I will report on behalf of the Marine Litter Working Group and also on behalf of the co-leads, the session leads and the rapporteurs, which were more than a dozen that contributed over the whole week, and you can see their names listed here. In short, we had 14 marine litter experts leading 7 thematic sessions with a total of 17 hours of presentations and discussion time during this week. Our goal was to cover all major aspects related to marine litter, from policy and research and regular monitoring to data management and aspects of co-creation of knowledge. And of course, with the theme of the role of developing and promoting best practices in all these elements of the process. We had between 20 and 75 participants attending each of the sessions, and the video recordings are available for participants to view at least until the end of the workshop. So we've got quite a number of recommendations regarding the future needs of the marine litter community. And I think we've identified quite a number of opportunities to cross-check with recommendations from other working groups, such as the one that Pierluigi just presented on, or the one on the training guidance, uncertainty quantification, ethics, and possibly more. So you will see those highlighted on the slides in yellow. There's quite a bit of text in the next slides. It's not for me to go over them in detail now, but hopefully it will be useful for OBPS when you synthesize the recommendations over the weekend and early next week. So just a brief review of the sort of summary and recommendations from each of the sessions. In session 1 on global frameworks for setting priority variables and indicators, we've importantly identified the need to better communicate between and reconcile existing global frameworks. On one hand, the environmental-based monitoring frameworks using the SDG and the CBD indicators, and on the other one, the sort of more science-based ocean observations using ocean essential variables. So an interesting outcome is that the roadmap for establishment of the marine microplastics monitoring and a data hub was put forward, presented as an initiative by Japan and G20, and that will seek endorsement and support from UN and other organizations, providing a real opportunity also under the UN Ocean Decade for Sustainable Development to really establish coordinated marine litter monitoring. And this can be supplemented by some other actions that you can, and recommendations listed here. In another session on towards standard and sampling protocols, we had a review of the existing monitoring guidelines provided by GASAMP, and we also addressed the challenges to consider a whole number of criteria such as scientific, methodological, environmental, technical, and ethical constraints when recommending and adopting common methodologies. So you can see just a summary table here. A quick run through the recommendations. We agreed it's important to shortlist the most relevant indicators that are feasible to upscale globally. You can see some suggestions listed here. And we would like to, if you go into look at point 5, it's important that we need to consider technical workshops which would further harmonize these approaches and protocols for each of these globally relevant indicators. And this should also go hand in hand with defining the best possible approaches to manage the data. So that's an opportunity to cross-check with the Data and Info Management Working Group. In terms of the role of OBPS, we see it as not only to make the best practices available, but also to help promote their adoption and use, especially at the level of quality control or database integration steps of the whole life cycle of marine plastic monitoring. Towards best practices for remote sensing, you can see a summary here of sort of where it is. It's really an emerging research field and consequently still focused on research and demonstrations. But the community is already establishing, adapting, and updating operating protocols based on the existing ones, for example, as provided by the Ocean Color remote sensing community. In terms of the recommendations, standardized methodologies for obtaining consistent high-quality datasets that have traceable uncertainties and are comparable among the scientific community. And there is also a need for these standards to include, for example, open access datasets in standardized formats that can be used for remote sensing algorithm training. Best practices for citizen science, a really important component of the whole monitoring system. It has the potential to produce both robust information for scientific research and policy-driven responses, but also to promote engagement of the society to combat the whole issue of marine litter pollution. Some important aspects we feel that need to be considered. There are ethical requirements, for example, how to acknowledge citizen science properly, maybe give them certificates, how to protect them during cleanups when dealing with some harmful contaminants, for example. Training, very important to ensure the right level, data quality coming out of it. And here we see a cross-check with the Training and Guidance Working Group, and Jay let me know that Sophie Sayaf, for example, mentioned this already in their sessions, that maybe there's an opportunity for future courses offered by the Ocean Teacher Global Academy on how to better train citizen scientists, and this should be integrated into ongoing campaigns. Best practices for modeling, just very quickly, some recommendations that intercomparison of global marine litter models, at least based on which are at least those which are based on general ocean circulation models, is recommended. There's also a need for more collaborative efforts to develop plastics life cycle models. So not just to look at the trajectories in the ocean and the sources, but also at what happens in terms of breakdown of and integrate the whole life cycle in the marine environment. And lastly, the global platform for marine litter monitoring and informing action. It's a concept developed by UN Environment for a global multi-stakeholder platform on marine litter. This would be used to coordinate action, centralize data and information available on the topic. Some of the ongoing efforts include evaluation of existing marine litter databases and how they can be integrated in the platform. At the moment, it's very scattered, very fragmented, and it's difficult to say that these data meet any of the FAIR principle standards. So there's a lot of work to do, and I think guidance from the Data and Info Management Working Group would be really relevant here. An interesting point about the use of artificial intelligence methods to derive relevant data from the citizen science campaigns. And this is a collaboration with IBM, where they've already developed pilot projects on reliability scores. And maybe this approach could also be used somewhere else to better estimate and target uncertainty in these kind of sampling campaigns. And
Excuse me,
here,
Artur, you got a final summary that you could make?
Yep. And
Thank
so as a final summary of all, we are really keen on having some follow-up meetings or workshops to address the different themes cutting across the different sessions, which contribute to the whole marine litter monitoring. So we hope to sort of bring this all up together during the 7th International Marine Debris Conference, which is currently planned for 2022. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And we have a final presentation now from Juliette Hermes on convergence and endorsement of best practices. Juliette?
Hi, thank you for accommodating me a little bit later. Can you see my screen?
You're very welcome. We can't see your screen at the moment. Here we go. It started screen sharing and now we can. We see your emails.
We don't see you though.
There we go. Now we have your slides. Do you want to turn on your video as well?
It's a bit dark here.
Okay.
But there, I don't, oh, there we go. Okay, thanks. But I have managed to listen into quite a few of those, and it's been really interesting to hear about what the other working groups have been up to. Thank you. So we were looking at convergence and endorsement of best practices, and we had 3 days of sessions with at least 30 participants in each day's session. So it was a really nice sized group, and we had people from all over the globe. So we had a really diverse array of input. And we had some really great discussions and examples and some really nice constructive criticisms as well, which we'll report back on and hopefully will be incorporated. So the purpose of our sessions really were to listen to the implementers. So we structured it along the lines of global, regional and organizational groups to try and understand how they converge best practices. And we really wanted to find common ground on looking at different points. So looking at motivating to create and review best practices or standard operating procedures, identifying frameworks, and looking at how convergence of BPs can happen and how we can support it. And also identifying bottlenecks and the needs of the community. So really the summary, what are the common grounds that we found? So just some key points here. Global convergence. We had a lot of discussions around whether or not it's possible. And sometimes if you can't converge, then you actually need to compromise on your best practices. We also looked in alignment with this to how we can actually adapt best practices to ensure that they are fit for purpose. So if you've got a very national best practice focused on a particular ocean region, how can you take that and adapt it to another ocean basin or another nation's needs? Some of the bottlenecks we looked at were assembling working groups to put together or converge the best practices, reaching consensus, identifying long-term oversight and governance, which is something that came up repeatedly on maintaining the best practices. And also really the idea of making people aware of the OBPS. We still had quite a few people in our group that maybe weren't as aware of the OBPS as we'd like them to be. And looking at, you know, even putting videos up and how you can make best practices. And one thing that we also really came across was that to be a best practice, it really needs to be updated every few years. And how are we going to manage that? So feedback to the OBPS, how can it help or support what we were discussing? So some of the things that we talked about was that every best practice should be associated with an expert via an email address or with an initiative, so that the user wanting to use that particular best practice, if they have any questions, they can get in touch directly. The other option we talked about was a help desk. So need to really have some discussions around how we can implement that. Continue to advertise the OBPS and have ambassadors. And then one thing that also came up quite a lot was a section for worst practices, where we write up exactly what not to do and the reason as to why not to do it. So again, there's this feedback feature for OBPS documents. That was something that's been raised quite often in the past, and I know that it is coming, so that if you're maybe using a best practice from one region in your own region, you can then put feedback on that best practice directly for other users to see, to say how it worked or what you modified to make it work. Another thing we talked about maybe was implementing a decision tree in the OBPS to help people get to the best practice they want to. And an example was the Ocean Acidification Network. And then also looking at incentives to produce best practices and to converge them. And so one example that was thrown out was offering free samples and free instruments to facilitate a switch of interested labs to these particular best practices. One of the next steps that we haven't quite managed to do prior to this plenary is to really look at the key outcomes that we had, and then to see how we could apply them across all the other working groups and whether they were relevant, and if so, getting that information to those working groups. So we need to just work a little bit more on that table. Maybe by this afternoon we'll have done that. There are still some open questions. There's still a lot of open questions, and I think there always are going to be more and more questions as we go on. So we really need to keep addressing those. We want to keep the Slack space open. We would like to form action groups to support the further convergence and endorsement. And I think what's been really nice is we've had so much interest and people so engaging. I think whether we'll form action groups or whether we just actually be able to reach out to these people moving forwards and have more one-on-one discussions with them. So I think it's been a really useful thing to do that. Getting people engaged and also present these action items at the next steering group and really try and assign priorities to them to get them done. So just thanks to everyone who attended and made really, really valuable contributions. We had some great sessions, and one thing that came out every day was a new quote. And so we've really been enjoying, we've put them up there, the quotes from each day that we had. Thank you.
Juliet, thank you very much for that. And thank you to all of our speakers. It's been an extraordinarily busy week with a huge amount of valuable insights and exciting plans for action. Ben, I'm going to throw over to you to send us all off to breakout rooms.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pip, and to everyone who just gave all those presentations, and to all of you who've been sitting and taking in all that information. I know it's quite a lot to hold and digest. We're going to move into small groups now to do some processing of that together. And again, to be focusing on this question that Jay posed in the beginning, that's based on the idea that the Ocean Best Practices system is a service that's being made available to your community. And so the goal really here is to understand how that service can be improved so that it really is as valuable as possible to you. And we are looking today at a synthesis focus in order to get at that with this question, which if you could put into the chat, Nana, that would be great. Just repeating it again. What are the key messages arising out of the themes, patterns, and synergies you're noticing from the workshop and the working group reports? What are the key messages arising out of these themes, the themes, patterns, and synergies you're noticing from the working group reports? So we'll have that in the chat to take with you into the breakouts. A couple of other things to note about how this will work. You'll be in groups of 4 or 5 people. You'll be put straight into those breakouts. You won't have to do anything. You'll just plop right in there. At the end of them, you'll get a 1-minute warning. And use that final minute to stay in your groups. There'll be a button saying return to the main room, and don't click that. If you do, no big deal, but you'll abandon your group mates. So use that final minute to just thank one another and complete your conversation. Also, you want to get clear at the beginning who among you is going to take the answers that you've come up with to this question. So your goal in these breakouts is to come up with 1, 2, or 3 answers to the question that we posed. And and to have those in written form that you can copy and paste. You can put them in your own chat, which will come back with you from the breakout, or if you write them somewhere else. But one of you is going to paste those then into the Codigital ideas engine that we'll be working with for about 10 minutes when we come back from the breakouts. So you'll paste them in, and I'll give you some more information, a little guidance on how that works, and it'll give us a ranking and give you a chance also to look at and actually tweak or suggest edits to the answers that others have provided. So we'll get into Codigital when you come back, but just be prepared for one of you to paste in 1, 2, or 3 answers that you've come up with to the question, which I see is now in the chat. Thanks so much, Nanan. Also, just want to say, you're self-facilitating in these breakouts, so just make sure that all the voices are heard in your group. Don't feel like you have to jump in as soon as there's a pause. A little bit of slower pace, pauses for reflection, a little silence is fine. And get to know each other and have fun and and enjoy your time as well. So with that, I think we are ready to go. Let me just double check that the breakouts haven't gotten a little wonky from people. It looks like, well, we have one group that got a little tiny, so I'm going to go ahead and redistribute a couple of folks. So you'll be.
Ben, maybe check, are there any questions?
We could do that, but I think we want to use the time to just go in there and just do your best. You've got the question, and we'll be coming back right at the top of the hour. So you'll have 20 minutes for the breakouts, and you'll get that 1-minute warning just before that. So you can go ahead and request help. So if you're really stuck or something strange, in the bottom of your screen where it now says leave call, it'll say ask for help, or there'll be something there. You could also come back to the main room if you needed to, where I'll be hanging out, and probably Jay and Anand too. But you two are going to go into a green room first, just to let you know. All right, so here we go. See you in 20 minutes. So welcome back from the breakouts, everyone. I hope you had some good conversations and you're awake. We got 10 more minutes to go here, and then we're going to take a break. But right now, we're going to play with the Codigital ideas engine. Nanad's going to put a link in there in a second, but don't go to it. I'm just going to share my screen and show you what you're going to see. And this should help you to understand how we're working here. Interesting. So we got 2 different things. Okay. So when you click the link, it's going to take you to a page that looks like this, and you're going to click enter as guest, and that will take you in. You can just skip the quick tour, just hit continue, and you'll see these, it'll be blank, and you'll see these 3 buttons. So if you're the person in your group who's going to be adding ideas in, you'll click add, and then you'll paste in your idea right there and click submit. Okay, and then the rest of you, as that happens, you'll see this start to fill up, and then you'll start to see that you can rank things, and you can also eventually resolve them. So I'm going to show you one we were just playing with earlier today. We just asked this sort of question about the cafe and what suggestions you have for next week. And so here's what it'll start to look like as you get some answers. Oh, the project is completed, so I can't demonstrate the things to do. Ah, look at that. Anyway, what you would see are those 3 buttons up here, and where it said rank, as it did back here, you would have a number, and you could click that, and you would see pairs. It would say, do you like this one or that one? And you check which one you prefer. And it also will have a little edit option there. And so you can say, I want to change the wording in this, or suggest a change to the wording. And you can go ahead and put that in. It limits you to 40% of what's there. And then you submit that. And then as those get submitted, you'll see resolve as an option. So you don't start out with the resolve. You start out with the ranking. And that's how it works. So you'll see this get populated. Again, it'll start to look like this, and you'll have those buttons there where you'll see all the different things that have been added in, and you'll be able to start ranking them in pairs. And what it does, it'll just parse out the pairs. You might see something more than once. You won't see everything, but everything will get evaluated. And then in the end, we'll have a ranking. You'll see the rankings actually change a little bit as we go. And we'll have a final report that I'll be able to share. And we'll actually leave this open beyond this 10 minutes. So we'll go into the break. You can keep playing if you want, or over even the next couple of days. We'll probably run a separate instance for tomorrow's group as well. If you have any trouble with the technology, don't stress out, just you'll have a little extra break. But this will be a way to just start to get an idea of what's coming out of these conversations and what your collective sort of prioritization is of what we're hearing. So with that, let's go ahead and start. I will play a bit of music and have some fun here. Yep, I see an idea is already coming in.
Sorry, how do we log in? Let me just.
There's a link in the chat.
Yeah.
I think we can
Oh,
enter.
enter guest. Oh.
Got it? I'll make a. There you go. All right.
Okay, so welcome everybody to session 3. I'll be the moderator for the next 45 minutes or so. My name is Rachel. What we're going to do now, we're going to hopefully have a bit more of an interactive session. So there won't be any formal presentations. I've done my best to kind of cobble together some slides and points to provide a bit of structure. But the first thing I wanted to do was to go through a word cloud. That's been a very common theme, I know, for many working groups. It is a nice way of getting really quick and easy visualizations of people's thoughts. So I'm going to share my screen now. Ben, that means it's going to stop sharing your sound, so we won't be able to do any cool music for your end. But that will be okay, I think. So let's bear with me for a minute. So you should all be able to see the Mentimeter screen. Can I just have somebody unmute and tell me? Yep, you can. Good. So if you could go in, listen, if you got a mobile phone, that's probably the easiest, unless you have multiple monitors. So if you go into menti.com and just use the code 5599129 that's listed there, and you can put up to 3 words or 3 hyphenated words or word pairs, whatever you want. And just tell me the biggest priorities for the Ocean Best Practices community and Ocean Best Practices as a whole. But the kick here is I don't want it to be priorities for you, your discipline, or your working group. I want them to be the priorities that you see coming out of the previous working group reports, your discussions that you just had in the breakout rooms, and some of the stuff from the Codigital platform that Ben just showed. So you can pop those in now. I will do the same thing. And also, as a cue from Ben, I have a new hobby with COVID. I quite like collecting hold music, like really, really bad hold music. So we're just gonna let this play in the background. This one's for you, Juliet. Probably leave it for another 30 seconds or so. Okay, sorry for the abrupt fade out on that. It's still going, which is great. I haven't put my bits in yet, but we can see that there's definitely some words that are popping out based on our previous discussions. And I don't think any of them are surprises for us. So decision trees were mentioned quite a bit. Interoperability is a big one, collaboration, training, and convergence. And then there's quite a lot of other words that have come up on the side. I'm sure all of you are familiar with word clouds, but if you're not, the bigger word means more people answered it, more people put that in there, and the smaller words were answered less frequently. So we'll take screenshots of those and make those available if you're interested. But again, it's just a visual way of kind of capturing the group's thoughts. And I don't think it's at all opposed to what we discussed before. So I'm going to try to close this, and then we're going to move into a little bit more of a structure. And we don't have to use this structure. I'm just trying to have something here for the next 45 minutes that we can talk to. So I'll just load this up. Now, the first thing I wanted to do was make a plug for the newsletter, because I don't know if that's been done yet. So can everybody see the PowerPoint slides? Nod or unmute?
Yeah, we see them.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Ben. Okay. So for those that don't know, the Ocean Best Practice Steering Group coordinates a newsletter called Good, Better, and Best, which is, I think, a quite clever title that Jay came up with a while ago. We're in, I think, the second or even third year of it, and it's just a way of sharing thoughts with the community, letting people know about what's going on. We have some feature articles. I've tried a few things out recently. There's a recipe section, there's a poem section. So we try and keep things engaging, but also informative. So sometimes I don't get the balance right, but we try. So if you're at all interested in this, I do recommend that you subscribe and just give it a crack for a few months. You can always unsubscribe, and you're more than welcome to share your meetings and your thoughts and some of your research and success stories with Ocean Best Practices with us through that. So anyways, that's the plug for that. And I thought in this session we could talk about some of the common challenges that we just saw, that we just talked about. And the idea for this is that Ana in session 4 is going to use some of these, I guess, challenges that we want to talk about to bed down some more recommendations. So there were recommendations given in every working group report previously, but we want to have these broader kind of cross-disciplinary and cross-theme recommendations coming out from this plenary. So that's where we're moving to with this. So the first thing we wanted to do was share the results of the Codigital survey that you just took, the little voting ranking thing. So there were 16 of us that just did that. And these were the top 5 rated ideas that came out of that. So as a reminder, the question was, what were some of the common thoughts, challenges, and patterns that came up in the working groups? And so you can see the top 5 here. I'm not going to read them out, but the point that we noted right away was that 4 and 5 are pretty much the same thing. 3 and 4 are very similar, and a couple of the others are similar as well. And so it really, I guess, shows that we kind of all thought that decision trees and templates were quite important, and this need for education and training. So that's from Codigital. Ben's going to make that more available once he's finalized it. And this is what I wanted to spend this session talking about. So while all the working group leads were giving their reports in sessions 1s and 2s, Ana and I were busy trying to scribble stuff down and try and find these commonalities. And so I just put these challenges that kept repeating across all the working reports up here. So you can see them in the left here listed. And then the working groups that explicitly mention them are here on the right. And it's loosely based on frequency. So the ones that were more frequently described are up in the top. So decision trees really came up a lot. And when we were thinking about these in some of the breakout groups, it became really clear that a lot of them actually had some commonalities within the commonalities. So there's this theme of convergence, incorporating some measure of quality or endorsement in best practice, ensuring they're fit for purpose, and dealing with the huge variation among disciplines and regions and maturity levels of best practices. And so I guess at this point, I want to open the floor and see what you want to talk about. If you want to talk about any of these particular challenges, particularly the ones in highlight, which are all kind of linked, or if there's other ones. And the etiquette for this session, we have a really small group here. I can't actually see the chat function right now when I'm sharing a screen. So Ben, if you could chime in with anything in the chat, or Kimberly or someone else. I can't see it right now. But if you can, I might need to stop sharing my screen. Ben, is there any way I can see raise hand or chat or anything while I'm sharing? I can manage that for you if you want. If people want to. Can you? Yeah. So I guess the etiquette is.
So just tell them how to do that in case not everybody knows. You click participant.
Yeah, go ahead.
Option there, unless you're a co-host or a host.
So I think we're small enough that people can actually just unmute and talk.
Yeah.
I have absolutely no issue with that. In fact, I wouldn't mind if more people unmuted because I feel like I'm talking to a cave right now. And if you are speaking, it would be great if you could have your video on as well. I know some of you are probably in your pajamas. If you're like me, you had a glass of red wine with you. That was me last night, not now. It's working hours. So please do feel free to be a bit more informal in this one. Let your video on, unmute, have a bit of a chat. So the first question here is, what challenge do you all see, or what challenges do you all see as the most important? And if no one pipes up, I will put that hold music on again.
Neil Davies here. I go
go
for
ahead,
the top one, the developing decision trees, and I'm just curious that one of the working groups that's not listed there was data and information management, and I just wonder what because there are a lot of tools that would be used in developing decision trees that would presumably come from that working group.
I think just because they didn't mention it or just because I didn't put it up doesn't mean it's not important to them. There's user error here too, so.
Well, there's that automated workflows, which sort of might be kind of sometimes, depending on what kind of workflows, could be a decision tree. Or.
I mean, so what we discussed in the working group was more about automatically suggesting which best practices are relevant, or which documents, rather, I shouldn't say best practices, which documents are relevant based on some form of user input. But we didn't really specify the front end thing. We're thinking about the back end technologies. So actually, it could be a decision tree, and whatever the input is, it's like a wizard to select things. Then that's the input for whatever technology is in the back end to start pulling in content. So we didn't talk about the front end too much, but certainly that's one interface form which could leverage the technology stack we have present already. So yeah, thanks, Neil.
Pierre-Luigi, do you have an example of one where you've got kind of an automated workflow that also segues into a decision tree?
I mean, there are decision support systems that are around. I can fish around for an example. I mean, we've all used one, like with a wizard, on our computer. It's like, answer a few questions and it takes you to a different screen. It's basically that. And then the backend can be as simple as, if somebody clicks this, go to this page, which I don't think will work for our system because there's so many options, or more complex, like based on the user input, the keywords they use, the things that they care about. Maybe they paste a few of their recent abstracts from their papers or the papers that they care about into the system. And based on the keyword usage, it will sort of look for similar documents based on that. There are many ways to go about it. What we would need then is like some beta testers, some people who have this need to come to us, talk to us about it, so we can think about how to design the user interface to leverage the technologies, because it's really hard to predict.
Could decision trees also be linked to training and education?
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, which is training has to be on the training group.
Yeah, actually, sorry, if I may, in our session in the training, we had a long discussion about decision trees and how it would help address the challenges or as I mentioned earlier, the hurdles in the process for people who are overwhelmed by all the data, all the information in the system, and also for the newcomers or those who are new in the community. It's really very useful because if it lays out different methods and then the data and resources available, and then it somehow serves like an entry point. I mean, people can figure out their respective entry point on how they can better appreciate the system. So that's how we actually discuss the decision trees in training. And if this could be a part of like a toolkit of resources that can be made available in OTGA, either in the repository of resources or either as a part of either is a course with determined learning goals. That's yeah, one of the focus.
And Johanna, in your training sessions, did you, when you were talking about the decision trees, did you identify any disciplines or best practices that might be good to develop a kind of guinea pig decision tree that Pierluigi was talking about? Something that we could kind of use to practice on?
No, we really did not delve much into that, like specific yeah, examples. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I think it's yeah, the decision tree discussion was actually from Alexis. I think that she has very rich experience in this tool. Yeah, she basically shared how she's doing it in her program, so that we haven't really delved in much into the.
Do decision trees represent a certain flow process? And in fact, doesn't that flow process relate to how various best practices are related, and therefore a combination of converging best practices across fields? So I wonder if there's a more elaborate way that we can talk about decision trees as relations between various practices and how they work.
Yeah, I could imagine, again, the interaction based on what is actually said in the in the document, the SOP, best practice, standard specification, etc., and the interface. So, for example, the first question can be, what equipment do you want? What equipment should the documents feature? And you enter some keywords about the equipment, CTDs, gliders, etc. That will automatically narrow down the collection of documents relevant to you. Based on the remaining tags inside those documents, the next question can be suggested from a pool of existing questions, so that it's a dynamic process based on the content of the document that are narrowed down through a series of questions. You know, which domain, which subject area, which equipment, things like that. That's possible. And there are multiple entry points in that process.
And then would we have something slightly different for the user? It's because I think I'm conscious of what Johanna said, and when people are starting out in this space and there's just overwhelmed with information, it's almost like they need to work by their use first. So what are you measuring? What question are you asking? What environment are you working in? So there might be, so there might just a couple options.
Yeah, I was involved in this discussion in the training working group. And when we were discussing it with Alexis, we thought that it could be just like a one-page information sheet where users can go to, where users can go to as a first point of contact with Ocean Best Practice System. So it's a visual tool. Okay, I'm interested in measuring pH. I can use a sensor, or I can measure it in the lab. And then I have enough money to do this one, or I have a limited amount of resources. I need to have a level of uncertainty in order to delineate a particular trend. So by kind of assigning an uncertainty threshold to methods, users are able to understand what they can discern from different methods. So if they need fine scale changes, then they have to go for the more expensive or more accurate method. But if they're just interested in measuring pH from different experiments where pH, they're only interested in larger changes, then they can go to the lower resolution or the method with a higher level of uncertainty, and they can still do their science well. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that we were thinking of. And then of course this could link to particular documents or SOPs that are stored within OBPS, but it doesn't have to be comprehensive, so it doesn't have to contain all methods. It can just have use cases to help.
Where the convergence would come in, right?
Yeah, I guess.
So if we can agree on a best practice for each, I guess, branch of that decision tree, then that to me is quite a strong thing. And it is actually converging best practices just on different branches based on your fit for purpose, your purpose, right?
I'm also thinking about something like Airbnb, where like whether it's experiences or a place to stay, you search on different attributes, whatever available in the tool, and there's like a wide range of different characteristics that you might want to search on, and then ultimately you end up with, depending on all your search criteria, things that are similar or like each other but fit your criteria, and that's sort of like your convergence. But at the same time, it allowed you to filter in on all these different attributes that you're interested in, not so much like a tree, but just like all these different ways of classifying things.
Pierluigi, have you investigated Airbnb's platform?
In more ways than you could possibly imagine. Terrible
That doesn't
thing.
surprise me.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's like any matchmaking technology, actually, frankly. Even with the UNESCO IOC project, this Ocean Info Hub, there's a module to matchmake needs with capacities, so that we can sort of share global capacity a little bit more equitably. And the technology is very similar to anything that just correlates what is needed with what is available. But that's where we need sort of stories, like user stories, right? And that's where the community can really help us. If like people contribute a short anecdote about how they created a collaboration, how they found a resource, how, and if we know more about how it actually happens in the real world, what we develop will be more useful, right? It won't be just a hypothetical sort of data thing. I mean, that's why like Airbnb and others, they'll do a huge amount of background research into what do people look for, what do people ask for, then they monitor the metrics about how people use their system, and they continually refine. So that's how we probably go about it the same way. But if the community could provide us with such stories about how they would like these decisions, how they make their decisions in the first place, that would help us design the system a little bit better.
And I just really want to emphasize, as a new user, 2 different EOVs and having to look at new methodologies from scratch. I think it is very important to have a visual tool to start off with, as well as a search engine, because if you just go to a search engine, you don't fully understand the problems that you're presented with. So having like a visual outline of something would help a new user enormously.
So it's Arthur here, if I could contribute.
Please do.
So, we often struggle with the fact that people maybe collect the data according to some standards, but they don't necessarily have the means or willingness to follow up with submitting the data into some repositories. So I think there could be a role for OBPS to promote sort of good practices of following up on the entire value and entire process of ocean observation. So this won't apply to all the things we've discussed during these working groups, but for a lot of things it would, I think. So that you go into the OBPS and you're interested in whether we arrange it around the essential ocean variables or something else that can be discussed, but then you get a complete lineup of the different steps you need to take and the corresponding best practices, from data collection to quality control to best practices on data streaming. And then you sort of, especially for a new person that goes into the field, I think that could be very useful and motivate them to follow up on the entire value chain and not just stop at collecting the data.
So that's something I've noticed in the repository as well. There's no coding that I know of. I might be mistaken, and I'm sorry if I am, but because some best practices include most of, if not all, the value chain, whereas some only focus on data collection or analysis. And it would be nice to somehow code that. I think we do have that in there, but it's not required field. And to me, it's very difficult to pick a best practice or a method if you don't know from the beginning what part of the value chain that represents. So I don't know if there's some way of making that a required field in the repository.
Mm. It could be, but one thing that we're very wary of is that we want to keep the number of required fields to a minimum and detect as much of that automatically as we can. Otherwise, it's a bigger burden to upload. Right now, we're at a reasonable spot. It doesn't take that long to upload one of these documents. Maybe
15 minutes is what Mark Bushnell told us.
10 to 15 minutes. Like if you get used to it and you sort of you have your metadata ready, like authors, etc., you can do it a little bit faster, but that's about right. So 10 to 15 minutes. And if we add more mandatory fields, especially those which you have to think about a little bit, it could be difficult. But on the other hand, if people start using, or submitters start using those templates, our technology will then know where to look to find that information, like which part of the value chain. We can provide some guidance on how to talk about that. It will look at the text and decide and automatically place it in one or more spots of that value chain. That would be the ideal sort of thing. And I think that best practice for best practices guide that Mark mentioned earlier, that describes the kinds of modules that we're thinking about. And it's in community review right now. So if you can suggest more of them, such as like placement on the value chain, that would be very useful.
I think that's a great reason for using the templates, is if they provide that automated attribute characterization, then that can feed into your Airbnb platform, right?
It's very early. Don't do this to me. But yes, but we need to know from the community what is important to actually codify in those little sections, right?
Well, on that tangent, do we want to talk about other things that might be important in best practices to codify, to establish the attributes for? So we figured out value chains one.
Well, I just put a link in the chat here, and it's this thing called the Res Cognito, and I'm just thinking about like some of the conversations have also been about like giving recognition for like following best practices or submitting best practices, or maybe even having complete metadata about your best practice. And Res Cognito is this like tool that's just kind of emerging. It's integrated with things like data site and roars and your ORCIDs and stuff, which is providing another platform to give recognition to individuals or organizations for other kinds of work, and not just like standard publications and things. So maybe that's like a tool, and also it has a way for organizations. So like ESIP is working with this, where ESIP is starting to play with the idea of recognizing people that contribute to working groups and things like that. So maybe like OSHA Best Practices could be one of those kind of organizations that could start to recognize contributors to the space, or give that added recognition in a different way. So maybe that's something to look at too.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else has heard about that.
Well, that was one of the other challenges, motivating to produce and share. So what motivates people? So getting recognition is one of the things that can motivate people to produce and share best practices.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about what was just being said about like the barrier to, not having too many required fields. But yeah, if you have more complete fields, of course you can do way more with that. And so maybe if we're encouraging people with like their score, and they have this thing of like cogs or something where you earn cogs, and we could award cogs if they have more complete metadata to their best practices, or if they're contributing best practices or whatever. Maybe something to look at more.
Or if we move to an endorsement process, where things are endorsed as a community reviewed best practice, then they have to have a certain number of cogs done in their metadata and attributes filled out, so that it becomes useful for any sort of decision tree or search function. So maybe that becomes a requirement of endorsement.
Yeah, so we're looking at as that tool in a working group around ways to have citations and attributions for different kinds of research objects, I guess.
Now, I'm conscious that there were some other challenges that are listed on here. So there's the ones that are highlighted, and everybody's right, automated workflow should have been highlighted too, because it fits in. Developing decision trees links into that. But there's a few others in here. Does anybody want to talk about those? Not just in regards to challenges, but we can start to think about the next session was on recommendations. So these are challenges, great, but what do we do about them? So we can start to talk maybe about some of these ones that aren't highlighted.
I actually want to please the community, because looking at the word cloud that was done live, there was the word interoperability, and that was one of the biggest things. So I wouldn't mind some discussion on it.
I'd like a definition of it, I guess. So for me, interoperability means that you can, I come at it from a data perspective, whereas your data can be used and pooled together in a reasonable way so that you can make predictions and use it in certain modeling and analyses. That's my definition of it. So I'm sure there's others.
Well, yeah, it's to be able to have one set of data that is produced, and that can be one set of data is produced, like for instance from the biology or the chemistry or anything like that, and then that can serve modeling or any statistical tool or analysis, or even like validation for satellite data products. There's a lot of different things, like physicists would use those data as well, like big biogeochemical modelers, and that's just really interesting actually to get some kind of interoperability, sorry for my accent, with regards to the data produced. I don't know, that's my thoughts in that regard.
Does anybody else have a different interpretation of interoperability?
At a broad scale, like so there's the fair interoperability, but that's a very specific kind of interoperability using knowledge representation and vocabularies. But in a broad sense, it just means that things can work across different systems, inter, between, and operability, things can work. So that's important in terms of like social aspect too. That means whatever you're producing in terms of code or data products or information products, somebody else should be able to use them very easily. That means you're using a common kind of framework that is not owned by either one of those stakeholders, but is a common way, like the web, right? We're talking over web technologies that we take for granted. They're interoperable. Our computers made by different companies can talk to each other through the web. We take this all for granted. That's what it is. That's a great example of what interoperability is. And it's important because that prevents lock-in. It prevents somebody saying, you have to buy my brand of technology in order to use this system. So it has a very important social role too.
And from a data role, it also would prevent certain agencies having custodianship over a particular research program or data collection thing if things are interoperable.
Exactly.
You can do it across regions and agencies and even funding streams.
And if I may share my screen, perhaps.
Yes, I will unshare my screen. Just give me a moment. I've got too many monitors, and there we go. Okay, go ahead.
So I'm just going to hop over. This is a really cool resource, this Rescognito. It's really nice. So in the ontology world, we talked about ontologies and semantic web stuff, right? So we develop some ontologies, and other people develop ontologies too. So if we define what a glacier is to the machines, and you can use this to tag up your data, you can use the environment ontology to do that, and it has a bunch of cool stuff that machines understand. But there's another ontology out there, the suite ontology. It was under NASA, now it's under ESIP. And the thing is, then you have a user who has to choose, do I use Envo or do I use suite? The user should not be put in a position to have to make this choice. So we as the developers of Envo and the developers of suite sort of came together, talked to each other, have a group where we align the definitions of these things so that if the user uses suite or the user uses Envo, it doesn't matter because the technologies can hop across from one to the other. So that's an interoperability demonstration. And that's taking the burden off the user, who probably doesn't have the expertise to make a choice about which one is appropriate for their needs, so that there's minimal negative impact if they've made the wrong, so to speak, choice at a certain stage. So that's the spirit that we use it in semantic web stuff. And I think it's a good illustration of this general concept of you're not boxed in. Because you've used one, you can easily hop over to another solution.
Ana, was that kind of what you were on track? Sorry, Jay, go ahead.
I was going to my most famous source, which is called Wikipedia, and looking at the definition of interoperability. And it's done, and this aligns with what Pierluigi was saying, is a characteristic of a product or system whose interfaces are completely understood, and therefore they can work with other products or systems in the future and the present, etc. So interoperability in that definition is an interface. But if I took two sensors from different manufacturers, and Seabird and another one, and asked, are they interoperable? I'd have a harder challenge because I'm looking at data quality and I'm looking at other things. So is interoperability include things like data quality? And I think we need to think of that as an underlying need for the community.
Well, I think interoperability does include data quality. That's one.
It's a likelihood that it will be reused by someone. So if it's poor quality, the likelihood goes down. If it can't be used in another domain, the likelihood will go down. So if you want to maximize the utility of what you're producing, then you should be pushed towards decisions that leave maximum possibilities for reuse. But that might come at a cost, right? So there's a trade-off there.
Yeah.
It also goes into the uncertainty working group. You need to quantify your error and uncertainty. Otherwise, you can't have any measure of quality, right?
Yeah, so we were talking about this throughout our working group, the fact that you need to quantify uncertainty in order to have interoperability. And the stuff that you were alluding to, Jay, is intercomparisons. So we were discussing if we should have a guide for comparisons of methodologies and labs, like the one that Andrew Dixon has done for carbon chemistry.
Is interoperability just at the interface level? Our computers can all interface to the internet and therefore, or does it go deeper than that into systems and comparability?
I think can go pretty deep, or you want it to go pretty deep.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's also important to scope it. I mean, as Raina rightly says, it can go to a degree that things simply seamlessly operate, and even the web is not that seamless. So we have to scope it because sometimes you just need you need to define how much interoperability you need to solve a problem, and yes, aspire to go further, but also be practical because we have to deliver for the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's an important consideration to take into mind. And on Neil's point, I think it's a good one because if you make your metadata on your data interoperable with others, and you make your data more interoperable, that's probably going to be a longer legacy than anything you ever publish or write, or, your papers are going to be buried by another 100 years of papers. But if systems can still discover your data set and leverage it and use it, that's probably the greatest contribution you would make in our digital age now. Who knows what's coming next, but that's just a feeling there.
Yeah, one area that I've been thinking a lot in terms of interoperability is maybe something that doesn't get talked about as much, starting to get more, is this concept of data granularity or data set granularity and collections, and what's a collection of data sets and what's a data set, and where do you draw the boundaries, whether it's space or time or volume or platform or instrument or whatever. Like, how do you define a data set, and how do you define a collection, or And it depends on the data source, if it came from an instrument or from observation or from samples or all these kind of things. And so I've been thinking about that a lot because it impacts a lot of what we're trying to do with interoperability in the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System, but as well as when you start to think about metrics of your data sets and like what's the value of a data set compared to another data set. If it had different granularity, you can't really compare them. Like all of Argo data, like Argo is one DOI versus we have one CTD deployment, that's one DOI, and you can't compare those DOIs in the, you know, so I think data set, like the granularity decisions on what is a data set is an important interoperability decision too.
Rachel, I'm just letting you know that there is also a comment from Arthur in the chat that might be worth addressing.
Can you read it to me? Because I just started sharing my screen again and now I can't see it.
Yeah, so he says, on ensuring inclusiveness, to what extent would OBPS be known to and or understandable for non-scientists? How do you make sure that our ever-growing citizen science initiatives benefit from and contribute to OBPS?
So that is an excellent point, Arturo. I think it's there. I don't know if you guys can see my screen again, but it's that third point down, ensuring inclusiveness of BP content and use. And I can't remember what working group mentioned it, but there was an explicit mention of non-scientists that might even have been yours. And so we've got not even 5 more minutes yet. I've just gotten the final call from Ben. So why don't we just talk a bit about how we can ensure best practices are more inclusive, including to non-scientists for the last bit.
So it's Juliet. We've talked about this quite a lot in the system, and I think, yes, for citizen science, the best practices should be available for non-scientists, but I think we have to be careful about taking on too much. I don't think we can now get best practices for scientists and make them available to there's no point in that.
Is that even desirable? Because then we run into interoperability issues.
Yes, citizen science needs best practices, but that's something separate from making best practices available to non-scientists.
I think we have a few in there though on citizen science programs.
Yeah, there are, and I know other groups are also interested in submitting more. Like one group over here in Germany, doing this science goes. They do stuff in pubs and bars and things. You know, you just show up and you start talking about science with the invitation, with permission. You don't just do it. It is Germany, and that's you know, that's actually quite fun. That's a you know, methodology that's of interest to the ocean community and can help to disseminate science. So, you know, my response to Archer would be that we probably have like a different user portal, same stuff, same backend, but there would be a different URL that you could access it as a citizen science, and things are pre-filtered. Say, you know, things that have a tag about citizen science, that would be the primary content with the ability to access other stuff. So I agree with Juliet. I don't think that's something we can do without like more partnership or resourcing in the short term, but it is something that we can gear our system to do when the time is right or when we do have such a partnership emerging.
And we can encourage deposition of
Absolutely.
Robust citizen science best practices right now.
Absolutely. The more of that we have, the better we can design the actual interfaces.
Christian speaking. Just related to the very last topic before jumping to the citizen science about the inclusiveness of other communities. In the fisheries session, it was discussed also, well, overlapping with data and information management, and discussing about the issue that some communities, they don't collect data, but they have a knowledge that might be transferred for the information management and the, well, into the whole process of, for example, a stock assessment or management of fisheries and so on. Some good ideas about linking the knowledge and the methods were also discussed there in convergence with the data management and information session. Maybe Pierluigi might.
So they took it down to the end of that value chain then, Christian?
Yes, this affects actually to the final societal impact of the products delivered, because yeah, there are some other knowledge that is not contributing in the sense of data collected, but from traditional knowledge of indigenous communities or certain communities like fishermen or etc. So that was an important point that was risen, and that we were exploring how to deal with that as well, of including this knowledge into linking the knowledge and the methodologies.
Good. Okay, well, that's exactly where we need to end. So we covered quite a few things. We covered decision trees and templates and automation. We covered interoperability and inclusiveness in citizen science, value chains, all of that. So hopefully that conversation sparked some thought in how we can actually take this forward and not just end after this workshop. If anybody's really keen, I am always willing and eager to see articles for the newsletter. So if any of those topics piqued your interest, please write a paragraph or two up and send it to me, and we can broadly circulate that out. And I think we're going to pass over to Ben now, and we're going to do a little fun session with some photos and graffiti, digital graffiti.
Exactly, or as Jay has termed this, it's pictures at an exhibition. We want to get you in touch with the more visual elements of things, and we're going to play with a tool from Google called Jamboard, being used a lot in education these days. So we have a set of boards. They all kind of look the same. You can, as one gets sort of filled up, you can just scroll across them at the top. I think we've got 10 of them, but they're all asking you the same question. What does a best practice look or feel like to you? And the two tools we want to suggest you use are either the add an image ones, so you can get a file from your computer and just drag and drop it here, or you can actually do searches. The only thing is, though, we want to be able to take some of these images potentially and use them in a public setting. So you can't just grab something off of the web randomly. So we're suggesting if you don't have an image of your own, or that you have the rights to, unsplash.com is a great website for things that are freely usable, Creative Commons. So you just put in whatever keywords you want and you get an image. You can quickly download it, save it, and then you can click and drag that over into the Jamboard and add it in here. As someone has right. You can also add sticky notes. So if you wanted to put a phrase or two in and stay in a linguistic mode, you can put different colors in for those. That's also fine. You can move them around. Once we've got some things in there, you can decorate a little bit with some of the other tools. And as the board gets filled up, just move over to another one. So we'll take about 5 minutes to go ahead and do that. I should put the link to the Jamboard in here for you.
It's already there.
It's already there. All right. Of course, somebody's got access to it, and we'll play a little music while we do, right? So here we go. Enjoy. And again, if you're having any trouble accessing this, maybe I'll just share my screen. Well, no, I won't do that because people want to see their own screens. I'll just play the music. Here we go. Thank you, everyone. We're going to keep this open, I think, for a while, and keep adding to it, right, Jay? Now we're going to turn it over to Ana to take us home.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ana Lara-Lopez, and I'm going to be moderating this part of the plenary. So it's basically, well, all the working groups were giving us their overview and summaries. We were madly writing down some of the key messages, and I think I want to do a shout out in here to Virginie, who actually helped Rachel and me to gather this information. And I'm gonna ask Rachel, so I can keep an eye on the chat, if she can share her screen as well, because we're gonna also use a little bit of Mentimeter. But the first thing I want to do actually is basically present what the recommendations, a circulation of recommendations that were that I captured while we were in discussions and during the presentation of the first 3 sessions. One of the reasons for that is also to make sure that I really capture the essence of this workshop and the real recommendations. And in there, after that, if there's time, I probably will open for some input, and then we're gonna use Mentimeter, which Rachel will kindly put up for me, where we're gonna do some prioritization, and sorry for my accent, of the recommendations, so we can basically check where priorities are and, you know, act on them. So Rachel,
sorry, Anna, bear with me. It says I'm offline, but I'm obviously not, because I'm still talking to you. So just give me a moment while I go back in your folder. Sorry.
That's okay.
I should mention I work for government, and sometimes our internet is not great, which is ironic because we've done the National Broadband Network, but I don't think it's going to work.
All right, I'll share mine, and then I don't know how we're going to do.
By the time Mentimeter comes around, it should sort itself out. We've been having a few interruptions today, that's all. Oh, wait. Do you want the hold music again?
You could also
Yeah.
send me or Nana the link, and we could try to do it for you.
Yeah, it's hanging too much right now. I'm confident it will be fine by the time you get to Mentimeter, but if somebody else can share this, either Vinny or you, Anna, that would be probably for the best.
I'll just share it. I have it on me.
Okay, I'll take over in Mentimeter. I'm sure it'll be fine then.
All right. So I'm not sure if you can see it. Can you see my screen and see the presentation?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I don't know if I can go in presentation mode. I don't know how to do that in present. Look at that. Okay, so let's start going through the recommendations. So the first thing, and we had a somewhat lengthy discussion about decision trees. So I probably, one of the recommendations, and the ones that are actually highlighted are the ones that the community identify as some of the most important one. I guess they ranked them before. So one was a decision tool for best practices. This can be flowcharts, decision trees, matchmaking, and these ones
Anna,
to go through.
Anna, sorry for interruption. You are sharing the wrong screen. You need to stop sharing and then share full screen.
Stop share. Okay.
Now select the screen with the full screen presentation.
Oh, so I have to put on full screen first, present, okay. Presentation, all right. And then, oh my goodness, I'm not very good with this. Can we just see it in non-presentation mode? Would anyone mind?
Or just drop the link in chat and I will share it.
Okay.
It's also fine in non-presentation mode. We could read everything.
Yeah, do it in non-presentation mode. I've just sent the link to your folder to Ben. Hopefully Ben can share screen once he gets it up. But for now, just do it in non-presentation mode.
Go technology.
Ben, can you check your email,
Sorry,
please?
everyone.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, so should I stop or should I?
Yeah, just
right.
keep going for now. I don't know how long it will take Ben, so.
All right, yeah, I'll just share this. Okay, so it's in non-presentation mode, but can you read or is it too small?
It's okay.
It's all right? Okay. So the other things that sort of resonated in there and was to promote and facilitate the coordination and collaboration of different communities. So that will be from like an interdisciplinary one with social scientists, computational scientists, the manufacturers. Also coordination and collaboration with the satellite community, the modeling community, and in situ. Including communities that are not actually in the ocean observing, but are on land-based, because we can actually learn a lot from all those different communities. Also with developing nations across the different scales, all those networks, observing networks that are global, linked to the more regional ones as well, and citizen scientists, we have a small discussion about that. And through that also develop outreach material that connects to the society and to the public, to citizen science, etc. So I think we discussed a little bit, and Arthur actually alluded to this during in the chat. So perhaps, you know, not necessarily housing their best practices, or if they have any, but outreach that, you know, this exists, that there's practices that are being developed, etc., just to get the public familiar with how science is being done, at least in the marine system. Ensure and promote fair, and that's not only in the data and metadata, but also on models and on training. So if we can have, you know, easily findable, accessible, interoperable and repeatable models and training that ensures that it's inclusive and that other communities that not necessarily have the resources to do them themselves can actually use them and find them and access them. So the other recommendations in here was transparency and collaboration through the co-designing, including also the indigenous communities and local knowledge. So when you're designing some of the best practices for particular things, facilitate intercomparison experiments through development of a guide for these activities, build partnerships with private sector and other stakeholders, for example, the FAO, the technology manufacturers. And actually a really nice example was Megan Cronin gave a good example where, you know, you have a particular sensor or platform, and the housing in the different, you know, research groups or institutions are being modified for particular purposes. And then you have one sensor that was similar, but then it got all modified, and it's, I guess it comes to the interoperable. So it's basically building that partnership with the industry where you know, if you do those modifications, you can pass it on to the manufacturers, and then this can be used across. So ensuring basically accessibility as well, and for these systems. Then facilitate, the other one is facilitate the development of best practice through the provision of well-developed templates, including use of case-specific solutions. And all this has to do with the ocean best practice system, maintain good version control, provide
better labeling process of the different best practices, and a traffic light approach was suggested. And also provide the the information of the experts that, you know, develop that best practice, so you can contact them, and if not the experts, at least the initiative. So the people that are using that best practice can contact the developers. Include the information on the cost of developing and applying best practice. Then again, highlighted in yellow are the ones that the community highlighted as important. Training material, they're suggesting online, but that's not just limited to it. With using virtual reality to complement for hands-on when it's only on a virtual mode. And basically they will be, for example, the developing best practices of how to develop training material online, and how to use virtual reality would be an interesting one. But basically that will ensure also transfer of knowledge. Prepare the ocean best practice system for digitization throughout the elements of the system, machine readable templates, automated decision trees, etc. And I think here Luigi gave us good examples of that. Distinguishing knowledge first, information first, or data first approaches in the documents that are in the system. Link the best practice to UN Ocean Decade. Also integrate and reconcile the global environmental monitoring with science-based ocean observations. So sometimes you get your indicators, for example, in Europe, they have this directive where they have to monitor how the ocean is going, and they will be applying their own practices. How can we actually integrate, converge with them, or, you know, facilitate and have a partnership with them in order to for them to take a best practice, or for us to learn from them. Promote the use of best practice in different communities, but not force them. So this has to be through community buy-in and co-design where it's practicable. So sometimes not sometimes, you cannot go to a community and say you must use that. So you have to sort of, the community has to buy into that best practice or into that methodology. Better communicate the ocean best practice. Some of the things that came up several times is that many in the community weren't aware of the ocean best practice system. So we probably need to do a better job in communicating what we are, and do better outreach. Interoperability, which is basically and the recognition of communities that develop best practices. And I actually did. We can go to the next one then, because I think I left those two and then put them back there again. So interoperability was also one of the biggest ones, and we had a discussion about it, so I don't think I need to repeat that, but it's basically to ensure inclusiveness and to maximize the use. Recognition for communities that develop best practice, maybe through endorsement, that was a very important one, and also one that was brought up by the early career professionals. And have case studies in the use of best practice in the system for particular fields. So that's just in summary all the different recommendations. There are quite many and diverse, but I would like to now, if I have some time, open the floor to for input, feedback, and then we'll go through a prioritization thing near the end. So any comments? Anyone first? Are you all happy with those recommendations, or do you think, you know, I mean, some of them will be probably more implementable in the short term, and others probably a more longer term. So if I can then pose the question, what would be the, in the short term, what do you think we should tackle first?
Christian speaking. It seems to me that at least the issue of the templates is quite, I would say, reachable, at least in a certain degree, as a second review. I mean, we already have now templates and so on, but I guess that we can always do a little bit more, or add another layer of perfection on that, or including the requirements that have been risen these days.
And building on from that, not just improving the template, but getting people to use them. So promotion and uptake of the templates, because they're not going to be much good if people aren't actually using them, right? And so that becomes more of a communications exercise.
And it's in there, for example, that I sort of would like to, as the community, that if they have the opportunity to use those templates to do so, and give us feedback on how we can improve, because that's something we can act upon quite quickly. Any other? I mean, some of them are more related to the Ocean best practice system itself when it comes to the templates, the versioning and all that. The other one will be more to the group and in the facilitation. And I'd like to hear from the community, how can we best facilitate coordination and collaboration between those the different communities?
I think you have to do that, Ana, by showing value to the different communities. I think they need to self-coordinate once we give them an appropriate value proposition. So I think what we need to do is take each of the different communities we choose to focus on, and there's too many to focus on all, and say, okay, what are we offering? And finally, how can we support them? Ask basically the case studies, the thing that, or user cases that Pierluigi mentioned can be an essential element of that.
One thing that came up in our breakout when we were coming up the sentence suggestions of what we thought needed consideration, Arto suggested that perhaps our panel structure like that of Goose, where it doesn't rely on specific individuals in there and the panel can swap and change, but the structure is there. So maybe forming that for an EOV to start off with, or different communities that you'd like to collaborate.
Yeah, that would be a good one. Having a community expertise on each EOV, which, can help us even like the carbonate system that has developed, and that's through Go on, I guess, that has developed these decision tools or is developing these decision tools. So now, I don't know how much time I have, but I think I'm nearly in the end, isn't it, Ben?
Yeah, a few more minutes. We're
All
trying
right,
to wrap up a little early, so yeah, a few more minutes.
Okay.
You can share now,
Yes,
Anna, if
Anna?
you want. I've got the screen and everything good now.
All right, so if you can share it. Someone else wanted to say something, so. Did someone else wanted to?
Yes, Anna, if I may.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, sorry. So I just want to make a comment because in relation to the webinar, the UN Decades webinar yesterday, where a common framework for collaborative and participative ocean research, and support for better integration of knowledge systems from different science discipline and ocean communities was highlighted. I think that OBPS is in a good position to encourage these transdisciplinary efforts if it can reach, as you've identified in your presentation, the non-scientific groups and engage, bring in stakeholders to better appreciate and make use of best practices. It would be nice if our OBPS colleague can serve the bridge towards the groups that they're working with to better promote the wide use of OBPS. Because I think it's difficult for stakeholders to know that there is this OBPS, without that kind of like entry point that would introduce the community to them. So yeah, just a quick comment on that.
Thanks, Johanna. Yeah, and that's a good one. I'm sort of in a way sometimes struggle to see how we can sort of facilitate that. But I guess now that we have how many register and are attending, I think it will be great as well to get the help of the community in trying to also promote this. I think we're having, I don't know, we're having some trouble with Mentimeter, but now what I would like to do is I put some of the, like a summary of the recommendations. I couldn't put all of them, but I put at least the ones that that came out as highlighted by the community. So if you can please go to menti.com, add the code. It's something similar to what was done with the cloud, and add your priorities in there. So I'll probably give you a couple of minutes, and then we'll close it and just and basically identify what are the highest recommendations and how we're going to tackle that.
Do you want some more hold music?
Yes, unless you want to sing.
Oh no, I'm not going to sing. Guys, I'm just listening to my playlist again. Don't be silly.
So I'm hoping everyone has had it's on Menti now, or are able to. If not, it is on the chat, so you can go to the chat, go to the link, and the code is in there.
So is Rachel finally singing?
No, just playing piano music. It's not even me.
I can't convince her. One more minute. That's a nice music.
It is, isn't it? Took me. This is my favorite one. This is #1 on my whole playlist.
The only problem I think I have is that there's people that are sleep deprived, so
I can go to my metal music list if you want, but
I need to keep them awake.
Yeah.
I think I'll just verbalize something that I said in the chat, considering decision trees are first. That it's important to note that we're talking about two types of decision trees here that may be linked. So first, the one that may be embedded in the search engine, and second, as a visual teaching resource.
Good point, Kimberly. I think we can probably, I guess I sort of worded that before we have the previous discussions, but we can probably
They're linked though, because you can't.
Johanna mentioned.
Yeah, they're linked though. I think you can't really, or you shouldn't do one without the other. So, because the visual one was going to have some best practices associated with it, which means it needs to be searching the repository or characterizing attributes from the repository.
All right. So,
ooh, dead tie. Sorry.
I know. We have 15 people participating and 26%. So some of them are asleep. Okay, I think we can close it now, right? We have a tie. So, so it looks like the first one and second, well, just by a very slim margin, is the decision trees. And I did see that emerging in many of the working groups talks. And as Kimberly said, it's, you know, one could be automated, as Pierluigi sort of gave an example of how it can be done, and another one can be visual. I guess I'll call them decision tools rather than trees, and you know, from there seem to be one of the most important, and that can lead to, you know, some sort of convergence depending on the fit for purpose and what we're trying to do, but not to a global one. Facilitate BP development templates, version control, and labeling. So I think that seems to be a very important one, which will basically allow the community to navigate the system in a better way and understand what's in there. Interoperability is still up there. And I think after the discussion we had, it is an important aspect. But as Pierre alluded to, it needs to be there needs to be some scoping on this. And the promote and facilitate coordination and collaboration, it's also seems to be a very important one. So, any more suggestions, discussions, or input? How are we going with time, Ben?
We probably want to pass it over to Jay to wrap up, you know.
Can I just ask one thing, maybe, and this is for Jay when he starts to synthesize things. It'd be really interesting to see the recommendations from this year compared to last year, because I suspect, and the year before even, because I suspect that there's some identical ones that just keep coming out.
Yeah, I think the ones that are, you know, relevant to the system with the templates and all that seem to be.
Although I don't remember decision trees being a huge thing.
Decision trees is a new.
We mentioned it in previous workshops, but it's never been talked about this much.
No. All right. Well, with that, thank you everyone for participating. I'm going to now pass the baton to Jay. Thanks, Rach.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Ana. That was a very, very interesting session, and I'm sure that we're going to see more votes as we go along, particularly from this to tomorrow, etc. Let me show a couple of view graphs just to summarize what we were seeing, and let me share my screen so it's bigger. Okay, you should see a summary and next steps. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, good. So your question, Rachel, was a very interesting one. What's new and what's not new? And I anticipated and then reinforced your question by listing some of the priorities that we've come across. And the ones in blue are the ones that were discussed last year. And that was outreach and creating a better understanding, training, capacity development was the word we used, and templates, which we initiated. These go at different rates. They need different levels of support, but it's a consistent story. What's new is we have not run into the decision tree concept in any of our previous work. We see much more emphasis in coordination across sectors, and now we're hearing partnerships. That was raised just very briefly in terms of industry, but it wasn't engaged. And then the question of Indigenous people, both from the decade and from some of the other work that's going on, and the co-design of working with them is something that's new since last year. Some of these things were raised at Ocean Ops. The Indigenous people were raised at Ocean Op, and there were some others. And maybe I'll compare next time on Wednesday some of the recommendations from there versus these. An umbrella over all of these is the interoperability question. In the Wordle, it showed first and was third in the Mentimeter, but it's of a different character than just implementing something in OBPS, because best practices are just one element of interoperability, but a very important one. And in the discussions with the decade coordination groups, interoperability and in fact best practices are getting very good visibility. And I think that's an opportunity. The decade was mentioned, but we certainly are seeing a lot of interest. So that's a summary of what we saw today. We'll have more as we move forward. How are we going to take this information and then do it? We need to consolidate the recommendations, and that involves this plenary, the plenary coming up in about eight or 9 hours, and then the working group, the organizing committee, and essentially the Ocean Best Practices Steering Group will get together over the weekend, Monday and Tuesday, and really go through all of the working group documents and bring this information and others together to a what I hope is a comprehensive recommendation, which we want the community to review. So we have a plenary coming up, the final plenary on next Wednesday, in which we'll bring our recommendations and you can review it. And then that goes to the steering group for consideration and implementation. And as I said in my introduction, we take that very seriously. And we thank all of you for taking the time now to consolidate this. I'd like to finish just with some acknowledgements. There were a lot of people that put this workshop together. Most of us had not known what virtual was, and maybe we're still learning. But we learned a lot about time zones. We learned a lot about how long or short meetings can be. And with Ben and Nenad helping us, it was a very good experience. And what we appreciate most is that all of you gave us positive feedback. And so in addition to acknowledging the team, I want to acknowledge you. Thank you for your contributions. And we hope you'll join us on Wednesday next week. And those of you on different time zones can join us for the plenary tomorrow. So thank you and have a good day. And we look forward to further engagement.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.